Welcome to Galactic Atlas Lore. If you enjoy these tales, please like and subscribe. If you have any recommendations you would like me to explore, please leave a comment. Let's begin. Grand Jedi Master, A History of Yoda. Chapter 1. Origins in the Mists. Long before the rise of the Empire, before the Clone Wars scorched the stars and the Jedi Temple fell in fire and betrayal, there lived a being so ancient, so enigmatic, that even the Jedi archives whispered only fragments of his origin. His name, simple yet singular, would become synonymous with wisdom, mastery, and mystery. Yoda. To speak of Yoda's birth is to venture into the unknown edges of galactic history. No one knows the name of his homeworld. The archives, vast, meticulous, and curated by thousands of generations of Jedi historians, contain no official record of the planet's location. It was hidden, either by deliberate design or by the passage of time itself. Those who attempted to find it found only charts that diverged, maps that erased themselves, and hyperspace routes that ended in silence. What is known, or at least rumored, by select masters over the centuries is that his species was incredibly rare, force-sensitive by nature, and aged at a pace so different from others that a child might see centuries before adolescence. It was on such a world, cloaked in mists and tangled forests beneath enormous blue-green moons, that Yoda was born, roughly 900 years before the Battle of Yavin. The climate was humid and warm, teeming with life. Local legends among fringe explorers spoke of a sentient people with enormous ears, deep green skin, and eyes that shimmered with cosmic understanding. Most dismiss these stories as fringe delusion, but even legends are born from some truth. Yoda's family, though lost to time, were likely humble beings, farmers or craftspeople. The Force moved strongly in him from the beginning. Stories passed down suggest that as a child, Yoda could calm stormbirds with a whisper and hear the flow of life in the roots beneath the soil. He did not understand these powers, he only knew they were part of him. When he laughed, the flowers leaned toward him. When he cried, the air shivered. The Jedi did not find Yoda. As fate would have it, he found them. According to a tale often recounted by Grand Master Yoda himself, he and a companion had set out in a small starship on a journey to explore the stars, perhaps as part of a rite of passage for his people. Their ship suffered a malfunction and drifted into uncharted space. It was then, stranded and with life support failing, that they were rescued by a passing Jedi Master, Nikata Del Gormo, a Hyselin who was also deeply attuned to the Force. Del Gormo sensed great potential in the small, curious being who spoke little but watched everything. Recognizing the power within him, the Master brought Yoda before the Jedi Order on Coruscant. At that time, the Jedi Temple stood proud beneath the gleaming towers of the Republic's heart-world. Its spires rose like calm blades into the sky, radiating peace, discipline, and knowledge. The young Yoda entered the grand halls of the Order not as a prodigy, but as a quiet, contemplative learner. He was unlike any species the Jedi had encountered before. Small, physically unassuming, and slow to speak, but the Force swirled around him with an unmistakable grace. The Masters debated long over his potential. Some were cautious, others were intrigued, but in time he was accepted into the ranks of the younglings. Jedi training began early, often before a child was able to form complete sentences. Yoda, though already older than his peers in biological years, began anew with the foundational teachings of the Order. He trained in the temple's great atriums where murals of past Jedi adorned the walls, and in the gardens that bloomed under artificial suns fed by Coruscanti power grids. His instructors taught him the three pillars of Jedi training: the Force, knowledge, and self-discipline. He absorbed it all. Not quickly, but deeply. Though he rarely spoke, when he did, it was with a startling insight that drew the attention of his instructors. He asked not how to fight, but why to fight. He did not hunger for mastery of the lightsaber, but for harmony with the living force. In group exercises, he rarely outpaced his peers, but he outlasted them. He could meditate for hours, barely blinking, his mind drifting through sensations in the Force like a leaf down a stream. By the time he was chosen as a Padawan, his understanding of the Force had already begun to eclipse some of his instructors. His new master, whose name is now forgotten even by the oldest droids in the temple, once remarked, "The child listens more than most speak, and in that silence he hears the galaxy." Over the decades that followed, Yoda journeyed across the galaxy on missions both mundane and miraculous. He calmed disputes between feuding star clans in the Hapes cluster. He uncovered a dark side artifact buried in the salt canyons of Mimban. He once spent 5 years observing a planetary civil war without speaking a single word of advice, only intervening at the moment both sides were ready to hear. His lightsaber remained mostly dormant in these years. His greatest weapon was his presence, a gravity of calm that bent even the most turbulent minds toward stillness. But the galaxy was changing. The outer rim began to fracture. Separatist philosophies rose and fell like waves, and in the shadows, Sith holocrons whispered across forbidden worlds. Yoda was still young, by his species measure, but already the seeds of wisdom had taken root. He began to write scrolls and journals in the temple archives. Many have been lost, but a few remain, such as the oft-quoted Meditations on Stillness and The Wind and the Flame, a treatise on Jedi patience, still studied by younglings to this day. As the century mark approached in his life, Yoda returned to Coruscant to take the trials. Not only did he pass, he exceeded all expectations. His lightsaber form was unorthodox, almost playful in its agility, designed not for brute force but for strategic evasion. His grasp of the Force, however, is what astonished the Council. He bent reality subtly, not by pushing or pulling, but by harmonizing with it. It was said that when Yoda meditated, the temple grew quieter, as if the city itself paused to listen. When the Council called him to stand before them, they offered not only the rank of knight, but the future. "You are not simply meant to serve," Master Oden York told him. "You are meant to lead." And lead he would. Yoda became a Jedi Knight. But it was only the beginning. The galaxy would call on him not for strength, but for guidance. And from the mists of mystery, a master began to emerge. Chapter 2. Trials of a Youngling. Becoming a Jedi Knight. The transition from youngling to Padawan was considered one of the most significant phases in a Jedi's journey. For Yoda, this passage was not defined by ceremony or celebration, but by patience. He was not chosen quickly. His unique physiology, unknown origins, and cryptic presence made many masters hesitate. While his connection to the Force was undeniable, some doubted whether a being so ancient in potential, yet so alien in temperament, could truly embody the Jedi way. But in time, one master saw past these uncertainties. The identity of that Jedi remains lost, swallowed by the centuries and the erosion of memory. What is remembered, however, is that this master did not choose Yoda for his raw ability, but for his silence. The loudest voices often echo from empty chambers, the master once said. But this one listens. He will shape the future not by force, but by understanding. As a Padawan, Yoda's training became more individualized. He began accompanying his master on diplomatic missions, planetary mediations, and cultural exchanges. Unlike many Jedi of the era, who often favored display or swift intervention, Yoda spent his early missions learning the importance of observation. On Chandrila, he mediated a dispute between agricultural clans by spending a month walking the fields in silence, listening to the rhythm of growth and harvest. On Boz Pity, he sat among the wounded in a refugee camp, offering no advice but his presence, which many described as soothing as moonlight. He rarely drew his lightsaber in those years. When he did, it was in swift defense, never aggression. His form, later known as Ataru, the fourth form of lightsaber combat, was not yet named or refined, but the agility and speed with which he moved stunned even seasoned warriors. His physical stature, so often underestimated, became an advantage. He moved unpredictably, danced around opponents with disorienting precision, and struck only when necessary. Yoda's trials, those formal tests given to Padawans ready for knighthood, came not in a single event, but through a series of escalating responsibilities. He was sent alone to resolve a border conflict on Taris, where two city-states teetered on the edge of war. Rather than intervene directly, he spent weeks walking between the two governments, learning their customs, speaking to common citizens, and crafting a solution that honored both sides without violence. When he returned to Coruscant, the High Council noted that his judgment, restraint, and compassion were far beyond his years. But what set him apart was his awareness of the living force, that intuitive aspect of the force connected to all living things in the present moment. Where others viewed events through prophecy and destiny, Yoda saw the now. The Jedi Order at the time was vast and stable. The Republic spanned thousands of systems, and the Jedi numbered in the tens of thousands. The temple on Coruscant served as the Order's heart, but there were enclaves on Ossus, Dantooine, and Ilum. Younglings trained in saber forms, meditation chambers echoed with chants, and archivists filled holocrons with knowledge. It was an age of enlightenment. Yet, even in those golden days, there were undercurrents of imbalance, whispers of dark side movements, growing corruption within the Republic Senate, and fractures in Jedi orthodoxy that Yoda observed quietly, noting how even light could cast long shadows. After his knighthood was conferred, Yoda declined celebration. Instead, he requested a pilgrimage to the Outer Rim, an uncommon choice as most newly minted knights remained in the core worlds under mentorship or continued study. But Yoda sought something else. "Knowledge I do not lack," he said. "Connection I must find." His travels took him to far-flung systems, Duralia, Lannic, Malastare, where he lived among the people and learned from cultures beyond the Republic's reach. He met warrior monks who channeled the Force through music, encountered Force-sensitive nomads who taught him how emotion could harmonize rather than corrupt, and learned that the galaxy was infinitely broader than even the archives could comprehend. These experiences would shape Yoda's later teachings. He began to challenge certain assumptions of the Order, not with arrogance, but inquiry. Why were emotions so strictly discouraged? Could attachment, when understood, deepen empathy rather than foster fear? Could the Jedi's centralized power hinder their connection to the wider galaxy? His questions were often dismissed or ignored, but they planted seeds in the minds of other thoughtful Jedi. Even as a young knight, Yoda began to gather followers, those who saw in him not just wisdom, but balance. Over the next decades, Yoda served with humility. He returned to Coruscant rarely, preferring to operate from lesser-known outposts. He defended convoys from pirates, diffused uprisings, and even served as a negotiator in the Galactic mining syndicate wars on Bespin. In each assignment, his pattern remained the same: de-escalate, listen, resolve, leave. But the galaxy was changing. New factions rose. The Trade Federation gained influence. Corporatists entered the Senate, and whispers of ancient Sith relics being uncovered on long-dead worlds became more frequent. When the Council offered Yoda a seat among them, he was hesitant. He saw the Council not as a reward, but as a burden. To lead, he said, not to rule. To guide, not command. But he accepted, believing that his voice might help the Order navigate the shifting galaxy. Thus, Yoda ascended to the Jedi Council. Quiet, small, and soft-spoken, but already in halls of marble and durasteel, many were beginning to say, "Master Yoda sees deeper than most." What he saw coming, however, was still veiled in shadows. Chapter 3. Master and Mentor, A Teacher's Path Begins. To be a Jedi is to serve, but to be a Jedi Master is to teach, and it was in this role as guide, instructor, and guardian of the next generation, that Master Yoda would leave his most profound mark upon the galaxy. By the time he accepted the title of Master, Yoda had already lived longer than many entire species. His patience was unshakable, his command of the Force elegant and complete, but it was his humility that defined him. He never demanded reverence, never lectured from on high. Instead, he taught with stories, questions, and riddles, shaping understanding not by control, but by reflection, and in doing so, he became the very heart of the Jedi Order. Within the walls of the Jedi Temple, Yoda's presence became legendary. Every year he would kneel among the youngest initiates, small, wide-eyed younglings barely tall enough to hold a training saber, and lead them in their first meditations. He would ask them strange questions, like what the Force smelled like, or whether silence could be louder than speech. He believed deeply that the Jedi path was not about power or control, but about learning to listen. He would spend hours sitting cross-legged in the youngling gardens beneath the temple's artificial sky, telling tales of Jedi long past, of trials that had no enemies, and of wisdom found in failure. The young adored him. To them, Yoda was not just a teacher, he was a mystery wrapped in kindness, the elder who never raised his voice, yet commanded absolute attention. Beyond the temple's polished floors, Yoda took on Padawans of his own. Though the exact number has been lost to time, it is said that he personally trained over 20 Padawans, more than most Jedi Masters ever did. Among the most notable was Count Dooku, a brilliant, headstrong young man from Sereno whose command of the Force was rivaled only by his skepticism. Dooku challenged Yoda constantly, questioning the Order's involvement in galactic politics and expressing disdain for the corruption he saw festering within the Republic. Yoda tolerated his questions, encouraged them even, but also cautioned him against arrogance and bitterness. "Wisdom grows from roots, not flames," he once told Dooku, but the seeds of doubt, once planted, grew in directions even Yoda could not foresee. Despite such challenges, Yoda remained a mentor of endless endurance. He trained not for victory, but for resilience. His saber techniques, while acrobatic and dazzling in combat, were taught not to dominate, but to disarm and survive. His teachings on the Force emphasized stillness, balance, and the need to surrender ego. "Control, control, you must learn control," he would say, not as a command, but as a truth. Learn over centuries. He insisted that each of his students understand not only lightsaber forms and meditative states, but the responsibilities that came with power. A Jedi must know not what they can do, but what they should not, he would often remind them. Within the Jedi Council, Yoda's voice carried increasing weight. He was neither the youngest nor the oldest on the council, but few could match his clarity of vision. While others argued policy or debated threats from pirate factions, Yoda would sit silently, speaking only when necessary, and when he did, his words would shift the entire debate. He argued often for restraint, for caution, for empathy. He warned against entangling the Order too deeply in politics, fearing the day when Jedi would become tools of enforcement rather than protectors of peace. Some listened, others dismissed his worries as overly cautious. In truth, the galaxy was changing. The Republic, though vast and prosperous, had begun to fracture. The Outer Rim grew restless. Trade guilds and corporations began purchasing senators, and though no Sith had been seen in over 1,000 years, shadows stirred in the Force that even the archives could not explain. Yoda responded to these tremors not with paranoia, but preparation. He revised parts of the Jedi curriculum. He expanded training for younglings to include more emotional intelligence, more cultural understanding, and deeper study of the living Force. He encouraged the Order to look beyond Coruscant, to re-establish its spiritual roots. He urged more Jedi to serve as teachers, philosophers, and mediators, not warriors. But even Yoda, with all his foresight, could not halt the wheel of galactic destiny. Outside the temple, he often journeyed to the planet Ilum, where young Jedi crafted their lightsabers from rare kyber crystals attuned to their Force connection. He would watch in silence as they meditated in the ice caverns, listening to the crystals sing. He believed Ilum reminded the Jedi of what mattered, that the Force was not found in conquest, but in clarity. And yet, for all his efforts, the pressure on the Jedi continued to mount. The Senate grew increasingly reliant on the Order for intervention in civil disputes. More Jedi were sent to negotiate trade treaties, suppress uprisings, and investigate political assassinations. Some on the Council welcomed this growing influence. Yoda did not. He saw it for what it was, a slow erosion of their spiritual core. He warned of dependence, of arrogance, of losing their place as servants of the Force. "Become generals we must not," he said, decades before the Clone Wars would prove him right. He also studied ancient texts, going back to the dawn of the Jedi, reading of the Jedi Order, of the balance between Ashla and Bergen, light and dark, and how imbalance destroyed their harmony. He saw patterns repeating like echoes across centuries. He meditated on these revelations not to act, but to understand. "Always in motion is the future," he whispered often, knowing the greatest enemy of the Jedi was not darkness, but blindness. Through all of this, Yoda remained humble. He lived simply, kept few personal belongings, and treated every Jedi youngling or master with equal respect. He did not seek titles, and yet the Council eventually declared him Grand Master, not by vote or ceremony, but by natural consensus. He had become the soul of the Order, the anchor around which the Jedi revolved. But even an anchor cannot stop the tide. In the shadows, something stirred. And as Yoda watched the stars from the temple spires, he felt a disturbance in the Force. Subtle, like a whisper in a storm, but it grew stronger by the year. The darkness had not been defeated, only delayed. Chapter 4, Council Ascendant, The Rise of a Grand Master. By the time Yoda's presence on the Jedi High Council became a permanent fixture, the temple halls had grown quieter in his wake. The others, Mace Windu, Ki-Adi-Mundi, Plo Koon, Oppo Rancisis, each held strong voices, different philosophies, and particular skills. But it was Yoda's voice that often fell last in debate, and when it did, it resonated with such careful consideration that few could challenge it. He was never forceful, he never needed to be. He had lived through more than 800 years of Jedi history, and in his presence even masters felt the burden of time. The Jedi Council in that era stood at a crossroads, high above Coruscant in a circular chamber with 12 chairs facing outward toward the galaxy they were sworn to serve. From that vantage, the Council shaped the fate of thousands of worlds, deploying knights and masters across the galaxy to preserve peace. But the line between guidance and governance had blurred. The Republic, once a collaboration of equals, had grown bloated and slow. Corruption had taken root in its core, often hidden behind noble titles and commercial interests. The Senate chambers echoed more with corporate lobbying than with ideals. The Jedi Order, in its loyalty, began acting as arbiters, not just of peace, but of law. Yoda knew this shift well. He felt it in the Force, like a great wave pressing against the hull of a ship. He warned his fellow council members that too deep an alliance with the Republic's machinery would erode their spiritual mission. "Serve the people, the Jedi do," he said, "not the politicians." But the gears of the Republic turned, and the Jedi, always duty-bound, allowed themselves to be drawn into its orbit. Jedi were sent more frequently to oversee trade negotiations, corporate mergers, and the policing of planetary disputes. The Council justified this as necessity. Yoda feared it was dependency. Even so, he continued his work. He mentored Jedi across generations, his most enduring legacy being his quiet shaping of Council policy and his subtle training of the Order's future. He was not a revolutionary. He did not demand reforms or called for upheaval. Instead, he believed in slow cultivation, planting lessons like seeds and allowing them to take root. Jedi like Mace Windu, with his unshakable discipline and moral rigidity, often clashed with Yoda's more fluid interpretation of the code. Windu saw strength in structure. Yoda saw danger in inflexibility, yet they respected each other deeply. Their differing views created balance. a balance Yoda believed essential to the Council. One of the more contentious topics in this era was the Code itself, a series of tenets long held sacred by the Order. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. These lines had guided Jedi for millennia, yet Yoda had come to see their interpretation as increasingly dogmatic. He believed that emotion, while dangerous when untethered, was not inherently corrupting. His experience with Dooku and others had shown him that suppression bred rebellion. He began subtly adjusting the way younglings were taught, encouraging them to understand their emotions, not just control them. Not all on the Council agreed, but none could dispute his wisdom. During this period, Yoda also undertook long meditative retreats, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, within the temple's oldest chambers. These rooms, often forgotten by younger Jedi, were rich with Force echoes, carved with runes predating the Republic. It was there that Yoda would commune with the currents of the living Force, listening not for answers, but for patterns. He believed the Force was not a tool or a weapon, but a great river, and the Jedi's task was to flow with it, not dam it. It was in one such retreat that he began sensing what he would later call the shroud of the dark side. It was not a vision, it was not a prophecy, it was an absence. Like something vital had been hidden, deliberately veiled. The Force, once vibrant in his perception, now felt muffled, distant. He spoke of this to the Council, but they could not locate the source. The Sith had been extinct for over 1,000 years. What could possibly be strong enough to cloud the senses of a Grand Master? The truth was that the Jedi had grown too confident. They believed the Sith extinct, the Order secure, and the galaxy stable. But Yoda sensed something different, an imbalance, quiet and persistent. He began searching deeper into the archives, exploring records that had not been touched in generations. He requested dispatches to worlds steeped in myth, Moraband, Malachor, even Dagobah, planets with ancient dark side histories. Though he never found definitive evidence, the feeling remained. The darkness was not gone. It was hiding. During this time, Yoda also met many of the rising Jedi who would come to define the final century of the Republic. He walked the halls with Qui-Gon Jinn, a maverick philosopher who challenged the Council openly. Yoda respected him, though he often warned that Qui-Gon's instincts could lead him into dangerous extremes. He mentored Obi-Wan Kenobi briefly during the latter's early years, noting his calm focus and loyalty, and he closely observed Anakin Skywalker, the boy brought before the Council by Qui-Gon, a child born without a father, prophesied to bring balance to the Force. Yoda was skeptical. The boy was strong in the Force, unimaginably so, but his emotions were turbulent, his attachments deep, and his fears hidden. "Grave danger, I fear, in his training," Yoda said. Yet the Council, against his initial judgment, allowed the training to proceed. He accepted their will, but watched Anakin closely, often testing him in ways that revealed the boy's inner storms. Throughout it all, Yoda remained a figure of quiet power. He could lift starships with the Force, disarm battalions with a flick of his wrist, but he preferred to teach with a whisper. Even the clones, when they would come, would say that standing in his presence felt like standing near something ancient and infinite, like the stars themselves had stopped to listen. And so, as the galaxy edged closer to war, the Jedi Council stood firm in its high tower, confident in its wisdom, secure in its strength. But Yoda, alone among them, looked not outward, but inward. He saw how far the Order had come from its roots. He feared what the future might bring. And in his dreams he began to hear a name, Sidious. Chapter 5. Echoes of Darkness. The Gathering Storm. Though the Jedi Temple on Coruscant still gleamed with serenity beneath the vast traffic lanes and sky lanes of the Republic's capital, the Force stirred uneasily beneath its polished stones. Yoda felt it most of all, not as a singular revelation, but as an ever-deepening murmur. For years the dark side had lingered at the edge of his senses like the whisper of a coming storm. Now it pressed more sharply, cold and elusive, like a breath drawn before a blade is drawn. There was a disturbance, not just in the Force, but in the fabric of the Republic itself. And behind it, Yoda knew, something unseen was moving. In the decades leading up to the Clone Wars, the Jedi Order had spread itself thin. More than 10,000 Jedi served across the galaxy, mediating disputes, defending neutral territories, and providing moral clarity to a republic that increasingly relied on their presence. But with each request, with each senatorial appeal for Jedi involvement, the Order edged closer to the web of politics it had once avoided: the Trade Federation, the banking clan, the techno-union. These corporate powers gained influence in the Senate, often operating with near-sovereign autonomy. The Jedi became entangled in their dispute, and in doing so, began to lose sight of the broader shifts unfolding. Yoda, now nearly 900 years old, remained at the center of it all. Still serving as Grand Master, he saw the Republic not as a monolith, but as a fracturing mirror, reflections of idealism dimming beneath layers of greed, fear, and manipulation. He spoke less during council meetings, choosing instead to listen for subtleties. The actions of Jedi like Qui-Gon Jinn had shown him how the living Force, immediate, intuitive, unclouded by rigid interpretation, could sense danger the Council could not. He had once chided Qui-Gon for defiance. Now, in quiet reflection, he wondered if the Order should have listened more closely. The signs of imbalance grew. On Naboo, a blockade escalated into war. A Sith Lord, Darth Maul, emerged from the shadows, a reality so unthinkable that it shook the Council's very foundations. For a millennium, the Sith had been believed extinct, their rule of two dismissed as ancient paranoia, yet here was proof, flesh and blade and fury, that they had survived, hidden from sight. Maul's death at the hands of Obi-Wan Kenobi ended the immediate threat, but the greater question lingered. If there was one Sith, there must be another. In the aftermath, a child stood before the Council, Anakin Skywalker, the boy with no father, the boy whose midichlorian count surpassed even Yoda's own. Qui-Gon believed him to be the chosen one, a being prophesied to bring balance to the Force. Yoda did not see a prophecy fulfilled. He saw a future obscured. The boy's future clouded is, he said gravely. Dangerous he is. Yet the Council, driven by Qui-Gon's final wish and Obi-Wan's steadfast resolve, allowed his training to proceed. Yoda observed Anakin from afar. The boy's connection to the Force was undeniably powerful, but it burned too hot. He loved fiercely, feared deeply, and trusted rarely. In private, Yoda meditated on this, seeking guidance from the Force, searching for clarity in visions. What he received instead were dreams. Flashes of darkness, of stars consumed by fire, of Jedi falling like rain. Meanwhile, Chancellor Palpatine, a seemingly benign and soft-spoken representative from Naboo, rose steadily in influence. He spoke often of unity, of stability, of restoring faith in the Republic. He forged close ties with the Jedi, particularly with Anakin, whom he called the most promising of the Order. Yoda noted this, unease tightening within him. The Chancellor's charm was masterful, his manner disarming, but the Force around him felt quiet, too quiet, a void where there should have been resonance. More battles flared. The separatist movement, led by Count Dooku, Yoda's own former Padawan, grew rapidly. Dooku, now calling himself Darth Tyrannus, declared the Jedi corrupt, the Republic broken. He moved like a shadow through galactic systems, recruiting systems to his cause, building armies from droid foundries and whispering truths laced with lies. Yoda felt a heavy sorrow. He had once seen in Dooku the spark of noble rebellion, a Jedi who questioned not out of vanity but of conviction, but the dark side twisted ideals. What began as disillusionment became domination. The war came suddenly, though its seeds had been sown for years. The Battle of Geonosis marked the Jedi's descent from peacekeepers to generals. Hundreds of Jedi fought, many died. In the aftermath, the Republic unveiled a fully formed clone army, commissioned under the name of a Jedi long dead, Sepho Dyas. It was a mystery, a trap, perhaps. But the galaxy demanded security, and the Senate, in desperation, gave Chancellor Palpatine emergency powers. Yoda traveled to Kamino, the clone production world veiled in storms. There he saw the vast machinery of war, rows upon rows of genetically bred soldiers, each engineered for obedience, trained in tactics, and imprinted with loyalty to the Republic. They called him General Yoda. He did not correct them. The galaxy no longer had time for titles. He led troops to battle not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. In the mud and jungles of Kashyyyk, in the icy wastes of Plutonia, Yoda fought. His presence on the field was mythic, tiny in stature but colossal in power. He danced between blaster fire, lifted tanks with the Force, and ended conflicts before they could escalate. Yet each victory felt hollow. Each campaign strained the soul of the Order further. He met often with the Council, now seated more in war rooms than in meditation chambers. Jedi casualties mounted, clone losses were treated as statistics, morality blurred, and all the while Palpatine's powers expanded, his presence swelling in the Senate like a tide no one could resist. In private, Yoda meditated. He spoke with the Force, listened to its echoes, but where once there had been harmony, now there was silence. The darkness had spread too deep. The Sith had not returned. They had never left. And Yoda, wise beyond centuries, now found himself surrounded by shadows that even he could not name. Chapter 6. War and Wisdom. Yoda during the Clone Wars. The Clone Wars, once an abstract notion of conflict, erupted into a galaxy-wide upheaval that changed the Jedi Order forever. Though the Republic painted it as a necessary defense against separatist aggression, the war was not clean. It was sprawling, insidious, and engineered by unseen hands. To Yoda, it felt like the Force had turned inward, knotted upon itself, as if the galaxy had fallen into a slow-motion spiral of destiny and deception. He had lived through local wars, uprisings, even planetary genocides, but this was different. This war was not just destroying lives, it was unmaking truths. The Jedi, long teachers and mediators, now wore armor and bore command titles. General Kenobi, Commander Skywalker, Master Windu. Terms once foreign became routine. Even Yoda, the very soul of peace, became known as General Yoda, directing clone battalions on distant worlds. It weighed heavily on him. Though he rarely expressed emotion, those closest to him, like Ki-Adi-Mundi or Plo Koon, sensed a solemnity settle around him like a mist. The Order, once monastic and detached, had become deeply entangled in the machinery of war. But Yoda did not resist the mantle of command. He bore it out of duty. On Kashyyyk he fought beside the Wookiees, old allies from his travels, holding the line against separatist droids in swampy jungles and mist-covered plateaus. There he displayed the full brilliance of his combat style, his small form moving with impossible grace, lightsaber a blur of green energy, leaping from enemy to enemy like a spark from lightning. It rarely used his powers to destroy. More often he sought to disarm, to end the fight quickly, but war made such restraint difficult. In this new reality, even mercy could look like savagery. The clone troopers revered him. Though bred for obedience, many developed admiration and even affection for the Jedi, especially for Yoda. He walked among their ranks without fanfare, speaking to each as an individual. "Each one of you," he told a young clone named Jek during an ambush on Felucia. "Unique you are. Not numbers, not machines. You matter." These words were not grand speeches. They were truths spoken quietly in the chaos, and they were remembered. But even as battles were fought, Yoda continued to meditate. He spent long hours alone in the high spires of the Jedi Temple, in forgotten chambers where the Force still flowed like a river. He was searching for something, a pattern, a name, a presence. The Sith had returned yet remained unseen. Darth Maul had been only the beginning. Dooku, once Yoda's student, had taken the name Darth Tyrannus. But the Master, the true architect of the war, remained hidden. On Coruscant, Chancellor Palpatine's control grew unchallenged. Emergency powers became permanent. Military production increased exponentially. Senators who spoke against him were politically disarmed. Yoda, along with Mace Windu and others, began to suspect. The Jedi requested oversight of the Chancellor's powers. They proposed early succession planning. Palpatine deflected with charm and legality. He always smiled. He always spoke of peace. But the force around him remained blank, an impossible emptiness. And then, in the quiet moments between battles, Yoda heard a voice. Not external, but within the Force. Faint, patient. Qui-Gon Jinn thought long gone, his presence flickered like a candle in deep mist. It was not a haunting, it was communion. Qui-Gon had discovered a path beyond death, not mere survival, but transcendence, a state of oneness with the Force. Through meditation and humility, he had unlocked what even the greatest masters had not, immortality of consciousness. Yoda listened, he learned. Guided by Qui-Gon's whisper, Yoda journeyed to Dagobah, a world steeped in the living Force. There, in ancient caves teeming with raw energy, he underwent trials not of blade or test, but of truth. He confronted his own fears, saw visions of Jedi falling, of a sky ignited by war, of himself holding a red lightsaber. He emerged changed. Not broken, but clear. The war would not end with victory, it would end with tragedy. Still, duty called. Yoda returned to the temple, bearing this new knowledge like a silent shield. He began preparing. Subtly, carefully, he trained Jedi to listen again to the living Force. He spoke to Ahsoka Tano, to Obi-Wan, to the youngest learners, always planting ideas. Lose yourself, a Jedi must not. Even when all is lost, he could not stop the tide, but he could leave stones in its path. When Anakin Skywalker killed Count Dooku under Palpatine's watch, Yoda felt a wound tear across the Force, not because Dooku was dead, but because something deeper had passed. Anakin, once so full of light, had begun to darken, and Palpatine, whose veil of deception had shielded him for so long, began to reveal his hand. The pieces were in place. The final act was near. In the war's final days, Yoda felt a profound stillness, like the silence before a blade falls. He meditated with the Council, he searched the Force, but the future, once a tapestry of potential, now shimmered like shattered glass. Then came a final revelation. Palpatine was not merely a manipulator, he was Darth Sidious, the Sith Master. The Jedi's ancient enemy had been in their midst for years, steering every battle, orchestrating every death. The Republic had not been corrupted, it had been conquered. When the time came to confront him, Yoda did not hesitate. He entered the Senate chamber alone, saber drawn, cloak swirling in silence. He faced Sidious not as a warrior, but as a guardian. Their duel shook the Senate itself, force against force, wisdom against ambition. Lights and thunder cracked. Platforms flew, yet in the end, Yoda fell. Not in body, but in fate. Sidious had won, not through power, but through patience. The Republic cheered its destroyer. The Jedi were branded traitors. Yoda escaped, broken in purpose, but not in spirit. He vanished into exile, carrying with him the weight of failure and the last ember of hope. The Clone Wars were over. The Empire had risen. The Jedi were gone. But Yoda had seen deeper. The Force had not abandoned them. It was waiting. Chapter 7. The Fall of the Jedi. Order 66 and the Purge. The end came not with blast of fire or proclamation, but with betrayal whispered across the stars. It was swift, clinical, orchestrated with such cold efficiency that even Yoda, with all his foresight, could not halt it. The Jedi had spent generations protecting the Republic, bleeding for it, believing in its ideal even as its truth decayed, and in return, with one command, they were extinguished. Order 66, contingency, buried deep within the programming of every clone trooper, a silent seed planted long ago by Darth Sidious, waiting for the moment to bloom. The signal spread like a ripple through the Force. Jedi across the galaxy, on distant moons, aboard capital ships, in jungles and deserts, fell to the very soldiers they had led into battle. There was no warning, no mercy. Some were cut down mid-sentence, others died defending Padawans who would not live long enough to flee. On Coruscant, the temple burned. Its beacon, once the symbol of light across the Republic, became a trap. Survivors, hearing the false signal to return, were ambushed as they arrived. Even the younglings were not spared. Yoda felt every death. Like a storm bursting through the quiet of meditation, each loss struck him as a sharp wound in the Force. He staggered when it began, standing among the Wookiees on Kashyyyk, watching as clone commanders turned their weapons toward him. Their loyalty, so carefully nurtured over years of shared battle, evaporated in a moment. Yoda did not hesitate. He ignited his lightsaber and defended himself, but his soul withered with every strike. These were not enemies. These were his soldiers, his students. He did what he must, but the cost was heavy. With the help of Tarful and Chewbacca, Yoda escaped the carnage and began his return to Coruscant. There he reunited with Obi-Wan Kenobi, one of the few Jedi to survive the slaughter. Together they infiltrated the temple, stepping over the bodies of their own. The sight hollowed them. Scorch marks on the walls. Younglings sprawled in meditation poses, never to rise again. And in the records, they found the final, devastating truth. Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, had fallen. He was now Darth Vader, apprentice to Sidious. He had led the assault on the temple himself. The pain in Yoda's voice, when he spoke of Anakin's fall, was subtle but seismic. He had never placed blind faith in the prophecy, but he had hoped. He had watched the boy grow, had seen both his brilliance and his fragility. And now, the light that might have saved them had become the blade that destroyed them. For Yoda, it was not just the fall of a Jedi. It was the unraveling of destiny itself. Obi-Wan would confront Vader. Yoda would face Sidious. They agreed without debate. There was no vengeance in Yoda's heart, only duty. He knew what must be done. He entered the Senate building in silence, moving through empty halls that once buzzed with politics. The confrontation with Sidious was not simply a duel, it was the clash of eras, of truths, of philosophies. Sidious, with his fire and hatred, tried to consume. Yoda, with his calm and clarity, tried to contain. They fought in the Chancellor's office, then in the Senate chamber, hurling force and blade amid symbols of democracy that had long since lost meaning. Yoda held his own, his speed and strength belying his size, but the Force did not favor him that day. He was not defeated by skill, but by momentum. The darkness had won not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of the people. As he tumbled into the Senate rotunda's depths, battered but alive, Yoda knew the Jedi had failed, not because they lacked strength, but because they had lost their way. He escaped into the underworld, vanishing with the help of loyal allies. Bail Organa, one of the last honorable senators, offered aid. Yoda refused to fight further. "Failed I have," he said simply. "Into exile I must go." It was not cowardice, it was clarity. The Jedi could not be rebuilt through force. The galaxy had chosen its path. To resist now would only feed the fire. Before disappearing, Yoda helped Obi-Wan hide the infant Skywalker twins, Leia with Bail Organa on Alderaan, and Luke with Anakin's stepfamily on Tatooine. It was not just secrecy, it was strategy. The children represented not just hope, but balance, two halves of a prophecy still incomplete. Yoda believed their time would come, but he would not be there to guide them. That was not his role anymore. He chose Dagobah, a world teeming with raw force energy veiled by its own natural shroud. There, in the swamps, he built no palace, no fortress, just a simple hut of clay and root. He meditated, he listened, he communed with Qui-Gon's spirit, who continued to teach him from beyond. In the stillness, Yoda confronted his own legacy, not just the failures of war, but the rigidity of the Order, the blindness of prophecy, the pride of certainty. He remained there, watching, waiting, as the Empire rose and the galaxy forgot the Jedi. Statues of Jedi Masters were toppled, the temple was repurposed, and in schools and records the Jedi were rewritten as traitors, warmongers, relics of a failed past. Yoda did not resist this narrative. He had no interest in revenge. His focus was on the future. He was no longer the Grand Master of the Jedi Order. He was the last ember in the ashes of a fallen fire. But even in exile, he held one truth close. The Force was not gone. It had simply gone quiet. And one day, it would speak again. Chapter 8. Exile and Enlightenment. Yoda's Dagobah years. The transition from general to ghost was not an act of defeat, but of purpose. On Dagobah, surrounded by swamps and fog, Yoda did not merely hide, he transformed. Exile was never meant to be silence. It was reflection. In the vines that strangled the trees and the still pools that reflected stars unseen from Coruscant's crowded skies, Yoda rediscovered something the Jedi had forgotten: the Force in its purest state, unshaped by doctrine, unswayed by politics. The Jedi Temple had towered above the city. Here nature reigned. There were no councils, no codes, just the living Force in every breath of mist and every coil of root. His home was little more than a mound of mud, branches, and moss, small, humble, almost imperceptible in the thick jungle. He slept on woven straw, ate from simple stone bowls, and communed not with students or soldiers, but with frogs, fireflies, and the wind. Yet the greatest truths came to him in these quiet years. Cut off from galactic noise, he listened to the Force itself, not the grand orchestration of cosmic destinies, but the subtle rhythm beneath it all, the harmony of birth, growth, decay, and renewal. He began to speak regularly with Qui-Gon Jinn, or rather with Qui-Gon's voice. Through years of discipline, Yoda learned to open his mind to this echo of consciousness, this presence that lingered in the Force. It was not a ghost, nor hallucination. It was the Force. Given will, shaped by one who had become part of it without losing identity. Qui-Gon taught Yoda what the Jedi of old had forgotten, that life and death were not endpoints, but transition. The true mastery came not from resisting mortality, but from transcending it through selflessness. In these meditations, Yoda prepared himself not for war, but for legacy. He would never again wield a lightsaber in battle, but his wisdom, his voice, would continue long after his body failed. The path Qui-Gon had found could be passed on, to Obi-Wan, to others, perhaps even to Skywalker, if he proved ready. The pain of the past remained, the fall of the Order, Anakin's betrayal, the countless lives lost under the Empire's boot, but Yoda no longer mourned in bitterness. He grieved with clarity. The Jedi had lost their way long before they were destroyed. Their fall had been a lesson, one he now understood fully. His days were long, unmeasured by schedules or missions. He tended to small plants. He hunted game in silence. He sat upon a gnarled root and watched the sky through the mist. The Force was his only companion. It flowed through the roots beneath him and the stars above. Sometimes he heard distant ripples, whispers of suffering, flares of violence, but he did not intervene. He was not meant to. The galaxy would turn, and in its turning the Force would balance. Years passed, decades. The world forgot him. Statues of the Grand Master crumbled on distant planets. New generations of stormtroopers trained in the shadow of Palpatine's throne. The Jedi became myth, a whispered name in cantinas, a symbol on dusty walls. Yoda remained still, like a stone beneath a river, unmoved yet enduring. Then, one day, the Force stirred, not with warning, but with arrival. A boy, a man, approached in a weathered X-wing, drawn not by maps, but by destiny. His name was Luke Skywalker, and in his eyes Yoda saw the fire of Anakin, but also something gentler, something searching. The Force pulsed around him, chaotic but strong. The last hope, or the final echo of the Jedi's failure. Yoda tested him, not with sabers, but with riddles, with patience, with silence. Luke wanted answers. Yoda offered questions. The young man was impulsive like his father, but unlike Anakin, Luke was not consumed by his emotions. He struggled with them. That was a difference. That was hope. He began to train Luke, slowly, then more urgently. He taught him to feel the Force, not command it, to surrender to its flow, not bend it to will. He spoke of fear, anger, hatred, the dark side's many faces. He told stories not as lectures, but as truths born from pain. The boy listened, not always well, but he listened. When Luke left too soon, abandoning his training to save his friends, Yoda feared the worst. But he did not stop him. He understood now that to forbid emotion was to misunderstand it. Attachment in itself was not a flaw. It was what one did with it that mattered. Luke's path was his own. He could not be shaped like a stone. He had to be grown like a tree. Yoda grew weaker. The Force called to him more often, not in dread, but in peace. His body failed, but his spirit sharpened. One night, Luke returned, older, changed. He knelt beside Yoda's bed, the cave lit by flickering blue light. Yoda smiled, eyes heavy. He spoke few words. Warned of the Emperor. Revealed the truth of another Skywalker, Leia. Then, with a sigh like a falling leaf, he let go. His body vanished. His spirit remained. He became one with the Force, not as a whisper, but as a light, eternal. Chapter 9. The New Hope Training Skywalker. When Luke Skywalker first arrived on Dagobah, crashing through the atmosphere into the murky swamps like a meteor heralding change, Yoda already knew he would come. Not through prediction, nor through any transmission. The Force had told him, through quiet whispers carried in the mist, through dreams where trees bent in the shape of a saber, through the echo of a bloodline that had shaped the galaxy's fate. Luke was not simply a student. He was the culmination of centuries of failure and faith, of choices made in temples and war zones, of prophecy and mystery and hope, clinging to the edge of a shadowed age. Yoda watched him closely, even before revealing his identity. He played the fool, curious and mischievous, poking through Luke's gear, testing his patience. Not for amusement, but for insight. A true Jedi must be patient, must listen before speaking, must see beyond the surface. Luke, for all his good heart and burning curiosity, was reckless, impulsive, like his father. And yet, unlike Anakin, he bore his longing not as entitlement but as yearning. He did not demand power, he sought purpose. That distinction, subtle as it was, meant everything. Training Luke was unlike training any other Jedi. Yoda no longer had a temple, no council, no galaxy of resources or younglings to shape. There was no time for decades of instruction. The Emperor's shadow stretched long across the stars, and Vader stood as its enforcer. The boy would have to learn quickly, or not at all. So, Yoda began with the core, not saber forms or Force abilities, but awareness. He taught Luke to move stones, yes, but more importantly, to understand why one should. He spoke of the Force not as magic or weapon, but as breath. Life, energy, interwoven in all things. Luke's time on Dagobah was brief by Jedi standards. Weeks, not years. But it was rich. Each day brought new lessons, not all of them comfortable. He was pushed to exhaustion, forced to confront his limits, and ultimately his fears. In the dark side cave, the virgins deep in the jungle's heart, Yoda sent him alone, without weapons. There, Luke saw himself within Vader's mask, not metaphor, but prophecy, a warning that the dark side did not live outside of him. It waited within. Yoda said little afterward. He knew the boy needed to wrestle with the meaning on his own. But time was never an ally. Luke left before his training was complete, drawn by visions of his friends in pain. Yoda warned him. If he rushed to face Vader, he would do so unprepared. He would risk the galaxy, not just his life. Only a fully trained Jedi Knight with the Force as his ally will conquer Vader and his Emperor. But Luke's heart outweighed his discipline. He departed. Yoda sighed, weary, but he did not stop him. He understood now that control was not the Jedi's role. Luke had to make his own choices, just as Yoda had in the centuries before. Time passed. The rebellion surged and staggered. Planets were lost and won. In exile, Yoda grew older, his body succumbing to the slow decay that even mastery of the Force could not halt. But his spirit remained keen. He felt Luke's growth, his pain, his confrontation with Vader, and most of all, his refusal to fall. When Luke returned, it was not as a boy but as something nearly new. Cloaked in black, steady in his words, guided by principle not pride, Yoda saw it at once. The seeds had taken root. The Jedi were returning. In the dim light of his final night, Yoda spoke plainly. He confirmed what Luke already suspected, that Vader was Anakin Skywalker, his father. But he also revealed something more. There is another. Leia Organa, twin to Luke, strong with the Force, hidden for protection, was a part of this legacy. In those last breaths, Yoda imparted what little he could. His voice faded, soft but certain. Pass on what you have learned. And then, peacefully, Yoda passed into the Force. His body vanished, leaving only his robes and the scent of ancient trees. Yet he was not gone. Through the path discovered by Qui-Gon and mastered in exile, Yoda retained his consciousness beyond death. As Luke stood on Endor beside the pyre of Vader's armor, he saw Yoda again, translucent, smiling, standing beside Obi-Wan and Anakin, not as ghosts, but as witnesses. The past, the present, and the hope of a future. Even then, Yoda did not rest. His voice would echo through Luke's temple. Through Jedi texts and meditations, his lessons lived on. Even Rey, generations later, would hear him in the wind, guiding her through doubt. The Jedi had failed, yes, but from their ashes something new had grown, stronger, wiser, more human. And Yoda's teachings, drawn not from dogma but from humility, were the roots. In Luke, in Leia, in every soul who sought peace without domination, who served the Force without vanity, Yoda endured. His exile had not been silence. It had been a seed planted in shadow, waiting for the light. Chapter 10. Legacy, the immortal voice of the Jedi. Yoda's death was not an end, it was a transformation. Where once his voice echoed in council chambers and war rooms, now it flowed through the very currents of the Force. He became not only memory, but presence, a whisper in the silence before a decision, a guiding warmth in the cold void between stars. His legacy was not etched in stone or immortalized in monuments. It was passed through choices, in teachings repeated long after his body had faded into the mist of Dagobah. Those who survived him carried fragments of his wisdom. Luke Skywalker, last of the Jedi by title, but the first of a new kind by spirit, built his philosophy on the foundations Yoda had laid. Not the rigid dogma of the High Council, but the quiet truth that the Force lived not in laws, but in living things. Luke's own students, some brave, some flawed, some lost, would wrestle with the same truths Yoda had, and beyond Luke, even those who never met the Old Master would feel his mark. Jedi holocrons, hidden texts, whispers on temple wind, each carried echoes of Yoda's voice, words spoken not for power, but for peace. In time, the galaxy changed again. Empires rose and fell, Sith returned in new forms, cloaked in new lies, and still, across the shifting sands of war and wonder, the name Yoda remained. In cantinas he became legend, a green gremlin with powers to lift ships and speak riddles. In academies he became history, a general of the Clone Wars, a failed leader, a ghost. But in the Force, he remained unchanged, watching, waiting, guiding. Those who truly listened to the Force sometimes heard him. Rey, born of scavenger dust and forged in hope, heard him through the ancient texts. In the quiet moments before choosing her path, Yoda's wisdom offered calm. "Pass on what you have learned," he had said. She did. Not perfectly, not always wisely, but with the heart of a Jedi shaped by generations of suffering and sacrifice. In her, as in Luke, the Jedi were not reborn as replicas but as something new, something better. And so Yoda's legacy is not that of a warrior, though he was unmatched with a lightsaber, not of a general, though armies followed him across star systems, not even of a teacher, though generations bore his mark. Yoda's legacy is that of understanding, of a being who saw through war and prophecy, through tradition and pride, to the truth that the Force binds all life together, not through control, but through balance. He began life on a nameless world, a member of a mysterious species, one of few ever to walk among the stars. He grew in peace, matured in service, and stumbled in failure. He watched friends die, orders fall, temples burn. He lived through 9 centuries of galactic turmoil, carried burdens heavier than any blade, and still chose humility over power. And in his last breath he offered not judgment, but hope. To study Yoda is not to study perfection. It is to study grace, the quiet kind that accepts failure, learns from it, and endures. The kind that asks not, "How do I win?" but "How do I serve?" That is what made him grand. Not his age, nor his stature, nor his rank, but his heart, his willingness to change, even after centuries, his refusal to surrender to despair. The Jedi Order he knew is gone, but the Jedi path he walked, that path continues in every act of compassion, in every refusal to hate, in every moment when fear is met with courage, when darkness is met with light. Yoda lives, not in body, not in name, but in the choices of those who carry the Force forward. And somewhere, beyond space and time, in the still center of the Force itself, a small figure watches, cloaked in wisdom, eyes bright with eternity, smiling.